Welcome, everybody. It's This Week in Tyranny. Thank you for joining me. Got a lot to talk about, so let's jump right into it. I'm your host, Konrad Rogoz. This is episode 104. It's Sunday, December 1st, very early in the morning for me. So, the story this week, Donald Trump announced that he would be imposing tariffs when he takes office. So, we're going to talk about tariffs, what they are. We're going to talk about more of the psychological, symbolic aspects, industrial policy, and economic nostalgia. I'm going to pull from some articles and really give the deep dive into this as I do. So I'm going to read his tweet that he posted on November 25th. I'm going to see if I could maybe do the Trump voice. As everyone is aware, thousands of people are pouring through Mexico and Canada, bringing crime and drugs at levels never seen before. Right now, a caravan coming from Mexico, composed of thousands of people, seems to be unstoppable in its quest to come through our currently open border. On January 20th, as one of my many first executive orders, I will sign all necessary documents to charge Mexico and Canada a 25% tariff on all products coming into the United States and its ridiculous open borders. The tariff will remain in effect until such a time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion in our country. Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to easily solve this long-simmering problem. We hereby demand that they use this power, and until such time that they do, it's time for them to pay a very big price. So that's what he said, and I thought, here we go. You know, this is the first major event in his presidency since winning the election. Yes, I'm aware that he's not the president yet, but it's absolutely part of the narrative. And several months ago, I predicted this narrative. When I was saying the impeachment trial and everything, I said that the impeachment trial and the censorship, it's actually going to make people support him. And when it looked like he was really getting railroaded and he had no chance, I thought maybe it's possible that they're going to set him up as this martyr candidate and actually have him win. Now, I said before the assassination attempt that he's going to win the election, and then definitely after the assassination attempt, and you knew he was going to win the election. So I pointed out those parallels with what's happening now in 1930s Germany and Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party. And I predicted that this second coming presidency is going to be much different than the first. It's going to be a lot more authoritarian. It's going to be a lot more nationalist. And right on cue, here we go with the tariffs. It's your first sign of authoritarianism. It's not loosening regulations, right? Not taking the shackles off, but imposing them elsewhere. And that's a classic move. There's a lot to talk about with this. First of all, what are tariffs? It's a tax on anything coming in from another country. But it's not a tax on China. It's not a tax on anyone bringing things into the United States. It's a tax on any American company that needs to bring anything in. In other words, it's economic blackmail to make people who actually do business and they actually move products, to make them do what the government wants, while also pushing them to do it, their way. It's just a way for someone to profit off of your belief that governments actually compete against other governments and they compete against each other. No, they cooperate with each other. They compete against you. Okay? China is not the enemy of the United States government. Every government's enemy is its people. It's an educated populace, okay? An involved population. Oh, that's a big worldview change that needs to take place in order for people to get that. But let it be understood. This is a tax on corporations to make them align with the nation, with the national ideals. And that is socialism. It just is. Now, the claimed objective of tariffs is to move the companies back to America, theoretically, which would be better for Americans. If the companies are forced to pay more to import foreign things, then the theory goes that they're going to find a way to produce those things in the United States. And when they do that, then the jobs will come back to the United States, and then Americans will enjoy lower prices as well and better jobs. And then the other countries will have to start paying us more for our work. But of course, in the short term, prices are going to rise. The people are going to have some hardship. But if they endure and get over the hump, then they're going to enjoy this economic golden age. And that is exactly socialism. That's exactly what the Soviet Union told people. You get all of these promises of a golden age if you just endure a couple years of hardship, right? We're gonna hunker down, and we're gonna work harder to make sure that everybody's on the same page and no one gets left behind, and we don't have these foreign corporations exploiting us. And it never works. It never works. And again, all of that is theoretical. The actual with tariffs is tax on corporations. The corporations increase prices to maintain their profit margins, right? And I will stress this. My personal view, the worst part of this tariff is that not only, it's not that it'll damage the economy and make my life harder. Like, I'm not that concerned with that. The worst part for me is that the beneficiary of this tax is the government. Is people who produce nothing. So these tariffs are, it's money that they're paying it to the government for them to spend it on what? Who knows, right? So it is an easy way to just extort some money from some people for doing nothing. And then they act like this is something they're doing for the people, for the country. It's an abomination in principle. These people stand with the flags behind them proudly, and then you and I pay for it all, and then they find a scam to take more money from people, and then sitting there with the bold-faced lie. But the worst of all is that they make it seem like they're doing it for us. This is the worst part of it for me. And look, the psychology of this upcoming presidency is already so pathetic for me. Like, mass deportations are one thing, but now we get economic protectionism. I thought we were all laughing at Kamala for trying to do price controls, right? We were all laughing at her. I did an episode about it, how ridiculous it is that we're talking about price controls in America. But how is this any different? This is just price controls from the producer level. It's just a smarter way to do it. Because you're not seeing, nobody's announcing these. The tariff's going to get announced, and then you don't hear about it because it's only the wholesalers, the manufacturers that are worried about it. So you're insulated from hearing about it. Whereas if you had government imposed price controls, you would see that. But it's all the same, and this economic protectionism is just a fairy tale of protectionism. They present it to us as, hey, I'm protecting you, I'm protecting your jobs, I'm protecting your companies, I'm protecting you, see? But it's actually business protecting the government is what this is. It's always been like that. And I hate this kind of cowardly pandering that, I'm protecting you. I'm so, as I've said, it's pathetic. I'm just talking about what it feels like, the sense, right? It's really pathetic. Now, the reason American companies and jobs are destroyed is because of years and decades of government interference. And look, Republicans have said it for years. They've said it for decades. That's the reason. That the reason things are bad is because they have all too many controls, too many taxes. We're going to lower the controls. We're going to lower the taxes. That's what Republicans have always said. But when they actually get put in power, when you put them in the game and it's time to deliver, it's actually time to fix it. We know the solutions. We've told you the solutions. You've said that's what the solutions are. Lower taxes, lower regulations. And every time they get in, you get more taxes and more regulations, but just in other areas. Okay, it's a classic move. And now it's taxes on exports and it's regulations on movement. If you think they're going to stop the open borders, they aren't. They aren't. They're going to set the trap and tighten the shackles on U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens, remember, that is who the government's enemy is. Its own citizenry, not the immigrants. And it's all the people in general. Remember, that's what the Patriot Act did, and anything that happened in the early 2000s. Remember, Muslims were the enemy back then, and the surveillance state, and the regulations against employers hiring illegals. Those regulations actually hurt you. U.S. citizen, because the businesses had to shut down, a lot of them, because things did work better when they could hire illegal immigrants and they didn't have to give them benefits. And it's not that exploitation is the way to go, but the minimum wage and all the benefits are just undeserved. It should just be based on your level of productivity. If these companies have to pay a garbage worker overtime and benefits, and then the illegals are still here and they're still on healthcare, right? So you haven't really solved the problem. You've implemented these regulations that are going to cut a whole lot of businesses out, but then you haven't really dealt with what you were trying to deal with. You just slapped the law on it, right? And then you're bleeding from two different directions. So you have the same thing. This country actually would return to its former glory and actually be better than ever. Just let the companies go. Let them go about their business without jumping through hoops. And that's what a confident nation would be. That's what confident people do. Confident people are not scared of you or what you're going to do, right? They're not worried about what China's going to do. Confident people don't worry about what you're doing. Enough with the spoon feeding, okay? And tariffs, in addition to being wrong and counterproductive, they're just so small. Like, they're pathetic. It's a very pathetic approach. This is not going to bring any kind of respect or power back to America. It's anti-American and it's anti-confidence. There actually is no other nation to fear. You guys, people think China can just pull all the strings of the world because of semiconductors. It's really a fairy tale concept that everyone has bought. They're not going to be able to blackmail the world unless we let them. And it's the same thing with the oil exporting countries. We like to think we're so dependent on Saudi Arabia and all this. There's only a dependence because of the government controls that are preventing us from actually doing what they're doing over there. China's not successful because they have intelligent, skilled people. It's just because they have the shackles taken off on their industry. Same thing with Saudi Arabia. So let them go. And on one hand, Donald Trump says this, but on the other hand, tariffs. Right? So everyone says they understand that the market's been manipulated, but then in the next sentence, they believe their facts and their rhetoric. Like, they believe that China is such a threat. Just let the market go free and you will see how weak China is. China, Russia, these so-called superpowers, they actually can't support themselves. They're fueled by the Western world. Cut them off and you will see. They run on fear, these governments. Turn your back on them and you will see. It is them who need America and not the other way around. But you see, the narrative is perpetuated because it's absolutely crucial that you believe that there is a red fear over there. There's nothing to fear. And it is so frustrating being one of the only people to understand this. Sleepy Joe got put in for two reasons. He's like a blind goalie. So let the United Nations advance all the globalism, run wild, totally push America out of its place as a respected country into the world to advance the agenda. That's one thing. Then you're giving half the people the impression, oh my God, someone's asleep at the wheel, right? All the conservatives, this is what they thought, like, oh my God. And this is so that you can build up the fear of Russia and China. That's what we've been doing, right? That's what has happened the last few years. This is the reason Donald Trump got elected, because everyone had the sense, hey, the world is passing us up. We've become a laughingstock. This guy cannot run the country. He's asleep at the wheel. Now Trump is going to get put in for another two reasons. One is to advance the same agenda, same old United Nations globalist agenda, but just in the ways that a leftist leader just cannot do. It's just a different approach, okay? It's the way a windshield wiper is not going to get everything off of the windshield. You're going to have to get the rag and you're going to have to spray it, right? It's this kind of a thing. That's one. And the second reason is you're going to terrify now the other half of the people. Those people who are going to crave the smooth-talking, progressive leader. They're going to want the institutions back, okay? They're going to want to go to the Cubs game and be able to talk all intellectual and say that everything's okay. And then they're going to be willing to ignore those red flags that are coming with the next liberal president that's going to take over. Those are the reasons. It's a great plan. No one sees it. Now, Donald Trump, not only does he make anti-globalism and free market look bad because he cannot articulate its principles, the guy just cannot speak, actually. People think he's such a great orator, such a great speaker. This is ridiculous. I don't know where you guys are getting this from. It's such a low level of, especially his content, like the cohesion, right? The points that you're putting forward. If you write the things he says on paper, the things are all over the place. It's non sequitur. And then even when you look at the manner in which he speaks, he didn't used to speak like that. When this guy turned into a preacher, like he's given a sermon. There's no character to this. It's like I've heard it all before, and I don't know when have the expectations dropped so much that we ignore all the globalist cabinet members, all the pro-Israeli talk, all the nonsense tangential talk, the theatrical nonsense he does, the pandemic response. We've got him on record doing all these things, and we ignore all that just because he can call a spade once in a while, you know? It's like marrying a woman who's 400 pounds, just smokes weed and drinks all day, just wants to argue and fight, doesn't respect you, and you stay with her just because she's got some big breasts. You know, it's like, is that good enough for you? Yeah, like, is that what we're settling for? That's what it seems like. You know, people are so willing to to settle for that, but it's not nearly good enough. And RFK Jr., same thing. Like, says some good things, great things when it comes to, you know, like vaccines and the medical world, but again, cannot speak. And it's very unfortunate in his situation. I'm actually sorry to say it like that, but it matters. Like, we're up against powerful people. It matters. The standards of communication have fallen through the floor. People cannot speak. They cannot articulate the correct positions. What are American principles? Because when has it turned into, you know, God and country? What about natural rights? Like, where are we talking about the roots of rights, self-defense? What about the principles? What about individuality, right? Are we really for free market? Because if we are, then we have to rethink the way we're approaching the rest of the world if we are going to break free from it and establish America as being a standout from the globalist agenda. Define the globalist agenda. When does he say anything about the United Nations? When does he say anything about the Federal Reserve? If there is a deep state, who's funding it? So you're going to implement all these changes without getting rid of the one who is, you know, pouring the fuel onto the fire, who's filling the tank? How, if you don't cut off their food source? Who can explain that? Plenty of people can, but they don't get nowhere near politics, right? So let's be clear with Donald Trump. He's a cleanup man. He's here to clean up. For all the people who didn't go for the traditional brainwashing, it's like a vacuum, right? Everybody, you get a big vacuum extension, you do that to vacuum the whole room, and it got most of it, but in the corners they didn't get everything. You didn't get all the dust. You got a spider web there. You know, there are hard to reach places. So he's for hard to reach areas, right? Like you see the vacuum commercials. That's what he is. He's like a narrow tip on the vacuum in the agenda for everybody that the big suck extension did not get them. Right? And we don't need different vacuum extensions. We need to completely reverse the flow. We need like a big leaf blower to get rid of this, right? And instead, we've just got a glorified cleanup man who's going to sound like he's actually changing things. And you're going to wake up in 4 years and realize nothing has changed. It's gotten much worse. And now this show is here to translate, to learn the language that the ruling class is speaking through these people. Anything having to do with tariffs and trade embargoes, anything having to do with protecting American industry, that kills the American industry. And that happens time and time again, but people don't remember. I get this like very scary sense that long-term historical knowledge has just been lost. Like even 5 years back, people don't remember what was going on. We're going to talk about the tariffs of 2018. They definitely don't remember what happened 15 years ago. And I tell them, 15 years ago, I was 13 years old. I was well aware of the military-industrial complex then. And back then, it was, I was 13, so it was Bush did 9/11. It was how he said it. I was also aware at that time that Barack Obama was a plant to lock down America further. And I remind people, hey, neocons used to be the deep state, so why don't you think they're there now? And people nod their head, okay. But it's very short-term thinking and forgetfulness. I feel like people are gone. They were, people were like having children at that time. These are grown men I'm talking to. But very forgetful. Now, it's come out after the tariff announcement. Canada is already considering retaliatory tariffs. Of course, more has even happened since I wrote this. Trump met with Justin Trudeau yesterday or 2 days ago. And of course, when he implemented the tariffs in 2018, Donald Trump did. It was a tit-for-tat response to new taxes on Canadian steel and aluminum. Then, of course, Canada implemented their own tariffs. And right, that's what happens in war. And whether it's military or trade, governments win and the people lose every time, is how it goes. And I've heard anecdotally that the steel prices exploded around that time when those tariffs were implemented. But truthfully, to get an idea of if that was the case, it's very difficult research for me. It's hard to, it's hard to even get a single answer of what happened to the prices because of economics. It can be complicated with the different suppliers and why is the price going up, why is it going down. And I was not in the construction business at that time. I was in a very different commodity business at that time. Now remember, around those times, 8 ball of cocaine was going for around $165. Those things were definitely cheaper. Official sources are going to tell you that drug prices are decreasing, and it's garbage. The advertised prices of drugs is decreasing because the purity drops. But the cost of the real deal is absolutely gone higher. But you wouldn't really know that unless you were involved, right? So when it comes down to steel prices, I really can't tell you for sure what happened in 2018 in Donald Trump's last presidency. But historically, I can. So we're going to start this deep dive now, the way we do on every topic, and we're going to go outside the box for sources, right? Fuck what the news are saying. We're going to read what the people who give the news their script are saying. So here's your article, Is Industrial Policy Making a Comeback? This is from September of 2023. Industrial policy refers to government efforts to support particular industries that are considered strategically important, such as semiconductors. It's been employed in many countries, including the United States, though it fell out of favor in the 1980s. The Joe Biden administration has supported advanced manufacturing to contend with worsening climate change, tumult in global supply chains, and China's economic rise. Familiar themes, right? Let's keep going. To its supporters, a new U.S. industrial policy is essential to respond to China's state-led development, secure a supply of critical materials and products, and develop technologies that could preserve the planet. They point to the use of industrial policy not only in China, but also in countries such as Germany, Japan, South Korea, as well as its historical use in the United States. To critics, that's me, such a policy inevitably distorts the free market and rewards companies not for the quality of their products and services, but for their skill in lobbying lawmakers. President Donald Trump upended the Republican Party's traditional stance on economic policy by imposing new barriers to trade, while President Biden has overseen the passage of major industrial policy legislation, including the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. So In other words, both parties are implementing industrial policy. Both of them. Industrial policy means the marriage of state and industry. So when they say it's essential to respond to China's state-led development, that means we have to have socialism to keep up with the socialists. We have to be more like communist China because we need to keep pace with communist China. It's like the arms race. But of course, no one remembers that the only reason a backwards, stunted development nation like China even has industry at all is because the Western world moved all of its industry over there. So again, I don't buy this world superpower thing. Okay, I don't care how many weapons they have. This is the thing. People can seem. This is the same way as bullies seem like on the surface they're very tough and they're very strong, but once you can pull out the rug from under them and see that they cannot support themselves, you're supporting them. And this is how it goes with really criminals and abusers. You cut off their food, right? If as the victim you're gonna cut off their food source, you're gonna see they cannot sustain themselves. China's not a sustainable nation, okay? Industries often included are those with heavy manufacturing or those that have military applications, such as aerospace, semiconductors, and electric vehicles. Policy measures could be protective tariffs. Remember, this article is over a year ago, right? So, yeah, very interesting. By the way, this article is from the Council on Foreign Relations. I didn't mention that. I said the people that are giving the news their scripts, right? This is the Council on Foreign Relations. These are people in the know, okay? So this is why I go to that as a source. They talk about the different things that industrial policy is. It's about the government putting a thumb on the scale rather than just assuming that market outcomes are going to produce the maximum benefit, says CFR's Edward Alden. So, hope you're getting a background of what it is. That's what we're talking about here. We are talking about government takeover of industry. Just because they is very patriotic doesn't mean it's not socialist. The history of industrial policy. Alexander Hamilton is widely considered to be the first major proponent of industrial policy in the United States. In his famous 1791 report on the subject of manufactures, the nation's first Treasury Secretary advocated supporting the fledgling U.S. manufacturing sector through a combination of tariffs and subsidies. Yeah, Alexander Hamilton, in other words, the bitch behind the first central bank. I hate Alexander Hamilton, obviously 200 plus years ago. I don't really know him, right? I don't know the guy. But just what he stood for and bringing in the first central bank, this is what destroyed. This is the beginning of the end of the United States. And it took hundreds of years for it to manifest. But it starts with Alexander Hamilton. Only 12, 15 years into this nation being free, you're getting the seeds of its destruction. And that's literally how it went. Experts cite of many of FDR's New Deal programs of the 1930s as early examples. These include the National Recovery Administration, which sought to regulate wages and prices across a slew of industries. The massive government-directed World War II mobilization that followed was also an extreme case. And I mentioned it already. I thought we all laughed at Kamala Harris for thinking she was going to win the presidency and implement price controls. Well, not only has it happened already with the New Deal, with FDR, now we're going to regulate prices through tariffs. And the crazy thing is it's already happened in 2018. I didn't have a show in 2018, right? I wasn't ready yet, but here we go. After the war, U.S. industrial policy was largely driven by competition with the Soviet Union, including the space race. Hey, didn't I just say that, right? A lot of this destruction of American industry is driven by this fear, the Red Scare. We got to compete with the communists, so we got to be more like them. Can you imagine? The Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, conceived in response to the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, has been credited with paving the way for the modern internet and the global positioning system. That's what the CFR is saying, right? They're saying, hey, industrial policy created the internet and created GPS, right, through DARPA. No, what has happened is they've ensured that those advancements that were going to happen, okay, just like the American Revolution was going to happen. So, they let it happen, and then you had Alexander Hamilton and FDR and everyone slowly take this country down. And of course, the Frankfurt School and Antonio Gramsci, and they told you all this, right? All the socialists told you this. We're going to take America down slowly, right? Bit by bit, step by step. Fabian socialism. The logo is literally wolf in sheep's clothing, right? But yeah, what DARPA has done is made sure that those advancements are going to be used for the destruction of that inventive spirit and that industrial self-sufficiency and everything that America used to be. And DARPA, what have they done since then? Have they fought communism? No, of course not. I remember over 10 years ago hearing Dr. Peter Breggin talk about the DARPA brain chip program. This is stuff that's very hard to find now, but I remember hearing about this then. Back to the article. What is the current U.S. debate about? Industrial policy fell out of favors in the 1980s and 1990s. But there is a renewed interest among policymakers on both sides of the aisle, primarily due to the rise of China, increasing economic inequality, the threat of climate change, supply chain vulnerabilities revealed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And all those things listed, I've talked about it, they were orchestrated. They were done intentionally to justify an expanse of government powers to make this possible. Democrats have increasingly put forward bold proposals that intentionally harken back to the FDR-era interventionism. For example, the proposed Green New Deal envisions a broad climate-centered industrial policy focused on clean energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing. On the right, Trump broke with long-standing Republican economic orthodoxy with the stated goal of bringing back American jobs, particularly in manufacturing. He imposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum products, washing machines, and solar panels. He took aggressive action against China, slapping additional tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods and blocking several high-profile Chinese acquisitions of U.S. tech firms. Did that help? No, it makes it harder for American businesses to compete. Some other Republicans have followed suit. The market will always reach the most efficient economic outcome, but sometimes the most efficient outcome is at odds with the common good. Marco Rubio said that in a December 2019 speech, advocating for a new U.S. industrial policy to counter China and bring back dignified work. And by dignified work, they mean spoon feeding. Right? I can't believe... Well, I suppose it's not that crazy, right? Then hearing about the common good, but to hear a Republican president say that, the free market is good, but the most efficient outcome is not the same as the common good. So you've got socialism openly being proposed by both political parties, right? You don't even have one against the other, and I predicted this happening. Okay. Anytime you hear common good, you're in big trouble, okay? That's just the way it is. Then this CFR article talked about some supporters, talked about some critics, and they had a list of references on the bottom, and one of the critics of industrial policy was Scott Lincecum, the director of the Cato Institute. And I didn't know the Cato Institute. I found out that this is a libertarian think tank, and I was very pleasantly surprised to hear that there are some strong points there, and somebody was giving an overall rational perspective. I thought it was fascinating. I'm going to link that article, and it's basically a response to a congressional hearing, right? He's speaking to Congress. This was the hearing on the supply chain crisis and the implications for small business. I didn't put the date here, but This is in the last 4 years, following the pandemic. He gives a background on what happened, right, to the supply chain during the pandemic. He mentioned that it was a loss of he called it just in time inventory management. It was replaced by a just in case inventory management, meaning that instead of people having confidence in the market, they now were in a very they were like hibernating for the winter, right? Everybody was hoarding, everybody was scared to make transactions because they were afraid that the system wouldn't collapse. And it's basically the confidence in the way things work is being replaced with a sort of like a food anxiety, when you don't know where your meal is coming from. That's what happened after the pandemic, and this is what threw off the balance of the whole world. And this is cut from the same cloth as tariffs. We're now going to be fearful instead of confident, right? It's a very psychological thing now. Instead of being forward thinking, entrepreneurial, everything that built the United States and all this wealth in the Western world, now it's fear of what's on the other side of the door, right? Now we're going to do protectionism. We don't have confidence in what's outside. We're only trusting what's on this side of the door, right? Then he continues talking about this was then amplified by temporary closures at specific ports and factories because of COVID-19 outbreaks. And it takes seeing the entire vision to now look back at this and connect these dots. It's clear that those closings at the meat plants, the ports, the factories, they were targeted. These closings were targeted. And I've said it before. The best example of this, of seemingly unrelated events that nobody can string together, but them totally leading towards socialism and the collapse of industry, the best example of that is Ayn Rand's book Atlas Shrugged. I'm sorry I have to keep talking about it, but it is amazing. I talk to people who have read it like, oh my god, are you seeing this? It's totally Atlas Shrugged. It's ridiculous how much it is unraveling just like this. You're just seeing things that you cannot really string together. A delivery came a week late, and then they couldn't fulfill the next order, and because of that order that couldn't be fulfilled, the trucker couldn't couldn't get paid that week, so he had to quit, and then you couldn't get another trucker because truck parts they didn't come in from a shipper from another country, and nobody really knows what's going on, but the whole thing is falling. Yeah, so that is my little endorsement of the book. Now, he says the pandemic supply-demand imbalances then spilled into the U.S.'s logistics infrastructure, creating bottlenecks that have exacerbated the original problem. This starts with the ports. He talks about one port, it was 25% lower capacity because so many vessels are caught up in record bottlenecks at the ports. Then he talked about the LA Long Beach port, right? The one in the Pacific Ocean, handling about 40% of total cargo volumes each year. Ships there were even forced to take the unprecedented step of just drifting offshore because all of the port space and the contingency anchorages were filled. Many speculate that these ships' anchors caused the recent oil spill off the California coast. It is just disaster after disaster caused by these regulations. And I did a show about the port strikes. These last two shows then I did with traffic and urban design. Two completely separate things, but in fact completely opposite things, right? One is ships in the open ocean, the other is cars packed in the inner city, but it's the same effect. Restriction of motion, backups, higher costs for less activity. That's what all the regulations did, that's what the shutdowns did. He says other choke points and simple coordination problems have added to U.S. port woes. Shipping containers, for example, have been stacked up at port, thus preventing additional boxes from being quickly unloaded. This is because there's insufficient truck and freight rail service available to pick them all up. Those backlogs, in turn, are reportedly due to a shortage in intermodal chassis. What shipping containers sit on when the trucks move them across the country. He's talking about the frames that the containers sit on, right? I used to drive a forklift. We loaded these things. So shortage of that and shortage of warehouse space. Without, continuing with the article, without a nearby place to put their orders, U.S. importers have left their containers at the ports, using them as de facto warehouses and paying high demurrage fees to do so. I don't even know what those are, but of course you're using somebody else's space. You're paying them. It's like if you leave your car at the impound, you're paying them fees to hold it there. Then truckers also report that pre-existing port rules on the hours of service, appointment times, and dual transactions, which require trucks to drop empty containers in order to pick up full ones, they've limited their ability to clear port backlogs, and nobody, it seems, can find enough workers. He says that, right? I'm not pulling that out, but again, it sounds exactly out of Atlas Shrugged. It's absolutely incredible. And he mentioned the truckers. We're going to talk about the truckers. Then he says, on the other hand, not everything can be blamed on the pandemic alone. And this brings us to my second key point for today, he says. A myriad local, state, and federal policy have surely exacerbated pandemic-related supply chain problems by overinflating domestic demand and intentionally diminishing U.S. supply chain capacity, efficiency, and flexibility. This is a mainstream economist telling Congress about intentional damage to the U.S.'s logistical system. Okay? I was very surprised to hear that. On the supply side policies, the problem started at the ports, he says. Longshoremen's unions on both U.S. coasts have leveraged their political power to shut down the ports, and thus the economy, to negotiate contracts that inflate salaries, limit working hours and job flexibility, and prohibit the efficiency-enhancing automation that ports in Asia and Europe adopted decades ago. Unions have also used favorable labor regulations to fight ports' efforts to supplement their workforces with non-union workers, something that might have come in handy during the current worker shortage. Let me just break down real quick. First of all, I talked about the longshoremen's East Coast strike, right? Remember that guy talking all bold about how he was going to shut down the economy because to get a fair deal. I talked about that whole thing, and I said it before and I'll say it again. Unions are a socialist pressure group. It's a gang. It's a gang that says, if you're not with us, we won't let you work. And that's what they did to these companies. They, went on strike and they forced them into these agreements that they cannot hire non-union workers, right, during a labor shortage, right? So they can't even pay somebody $5 to do this job because they don't let them, right? And then at the same time, they want to ban automation, right? Well, it's all about, we want to take these machines, we need to stop these machines from taking our jobs. What you're really doing is you're putting the companies in an impossible position because they're not going to be able to use the same technology as the ports in China. So obviously, this is a great example of this is what made China powerful. It's not anything they're doing. It's just you're not letting people here live. And this is another thing. I hate unions. They seem like they're for the people. They're for socialism. Whether they know it or not. A lot of useful idiots. And they call them that, right? In socialism, useful idiots. And then he talks about the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, aka the Jones Act, and the Foreign Dredge Act, which is basically that it bans these ships from a dredge is like an excavator that's on board a ship. So, there's a port, there's shallow water, it can actually excavate, right? It helps the ship to go through. It's like you're carving out the port as you're going, right? Again, I'm not a sailor, right? I've done some research about this, right, just to get familiar. Now, but it's of course made these things cost so much more because they're not allowed to use these excavators. The Foreign Dredge Act, it diminishes U.S. port and shipping capacity by limiting available port dredgers and dramatically raising the cost of dredging that ports need to accept more, bigger, and fuller ships. And instead, they have to avoid that now by port hopping, which is, I'm not very familiar with this, but apparently they use foreign ships, slower ships, just to get past the regulations, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do it because of the Dredge Act. And then these ships are prohibited from picking up additional cargo while they're in port. So it takes them longer to offload, and they're wasting space, they're wasting time because they're not allowed. But that's not it. He continues. Finally, state and local laws, especially in California, have prevented ports and other companies from expanding container storage. Last fall, for example, we learned that local zoning ordinances prevented container stacking on aesthetic grounds, and that caused a massive blockage and all that. In other words, there's a law that you can't stack them because it looks unpleasant to have a big stack of containers offshore. Then there's more laws on building new warehouses. Building a new warehouse can take as many as 9 years in parts of California, compared to a still slow 2 years elsewhere in the country. And that's because of California's land use and environmental regulations. Meanwhile, high U.S. tariffs have been imposed on intermodal chassis, which trucks use to carry containers from port to warehouse from China. China has the largest chassis supplier in the world, and it's banned from the U.S. market. Okay, so you have a shortage of that. Then California emissions regulations, they have reportedly pushed some port truckers whose rigs the regulations suddenly made obsolete. They've pushed them out of the industry. For these reasons, future government action on domestic and global supply chains should focus not on trying to outsmart the market or delivering target federal grants or loans to privileged companies and workers, but instead on broadly emphasizing economic openness, diversification, and flexibility. Reform efforts should start with the supply side regulatory impediments discussed above and others that impose similar harms to the U.S. economy. Reform should go beyond simple tariff relief and instead focus on making it easier for businesses to locate and invest in the United States. This argues for a different approach to achieving real economic resiliency than the ones primarily under consideration today, an approach based not on economic nationalism or top-down planning, but instead on the open and flexible policies that America does best. Sincerely, Scott Lincecum, Director of General Economics and Trade of the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute, by the way, was co-founded by Murray Rothbard, and I strongly encourage you to get familiar with him and with the Austrian School of Economics, because it's not just a few people on YouTube that are against regulations and the Federal Reserve. There are, professionals, there are people who are economists that understand this. I really wanted to focus on that, not just because it gives you a great layout of what's going on, but also the solution there. It's not nationalism, right? So we all know that globalism is the agenda, and a big part of this country has understood, hey, globalism is the agenda, war against globalism. But shutting yourself down and isolating America and making it harder for these businesses to function, you're not actually fighting globalism, you're assisting it. You're taking out their biggest threat. You're taking out a free and wealthy America. And now we're going to get into the trucks. I said I'd talk about the trucks. Now, trucking is another place where you could see the government control destroying American business. Now, I'm now in construction. I have been since really 2020. Before that, I used to be a drug dealer. And before that, I used to drive a forklift. And I was on this side of the business as well, loading these trucks all the time. Now I'm going to read an article called Truckers Take on Trump Over Electronic Surveillance Rules. An article from April 3rd, 2018. By the way, it's right around the time those tariffs were going up to protect American industry, right? This was the real story. And I was there when it happened. I saw these things get implemented, talking about the electronic logbook. I talked to the drivers about it, how things changed. Things changed everything, and it definitely made things a lot harder. Um, Wasted a lot of time, right? It made things harder for everybody. But we'll hear all about that. Drivers unhappy about electronic devices that track how much time they spend on the road are taking their grievances to Washington. It's amazing to me how many experts there are in trucking that have never sat their butt in a truck, said one irate driver. I really liked hearing that because, that's how it should be said. And they're fed up over this law requiring every driver to basically put it in their phone. They have a electronic logbook and they have to put in when they're driving, right? And it tracks them. And this article says this isn't just hollering about a surveillance state. The contentious electronic logging device has become a focal sore for independent truckers irritated by a rash of related regulations, chiefly that the government controls when truckers can and cannot be on the road. The premise behind it is that sleepy drivers cause accidents, they say, right? Since 1934, the feds have used hours of service laws to limit the time spent on the road in between rest periods. Currently, the rules hold that drivers cannot have more than 14 on-duty hours, which means 11 hours of driving, followed by 10 hours off the clock. They cannot drive for the next 10 hours. Now, those have been the rules for 80 years plus, but before this week, drivers they kept their own logbook, so you're putting in your time on pen and paper. Obviously, this article, a system that many liked because it gave them some wiggle room when the realities of the road made it hard to stay within those rules. Now with the digital monitor in charge, that's gone. Now, when you think about this, okay, they could keep their hours with pen and paper. So, obviously they could cheat the rules. But this is already seeing it in the wrong way for me. Those rules should have never been accepted. Those were never the rules. You cannot have somebody telling you when you can and cannot drive, especially when they've never sat their butt in the truck. So on the one hand, you're trusting people. These are professionals to get you their freight. They do this every day, and you're going to tell them when they can and cannot move, when they can and cannot drive. Everybody's body is different. You don't know how long he can go without sleep, or you're saying that 10 hours is what's necessary for them to recover. This whole thing should have never been accepted, and I find it crazy that 1934 it comes in. And this is because I'm sure it wasn't, not everything that is about safety, people buy it. Safety, health, people don't want to, because, nobody wants to argue on behalf of recklessness. Well, it's not recklessness, it's discernment. And to which some truckers replied, yeah, we did cheat our logbook, said John Grosvenor, founder of Truckers United for Freedom, a group that argues for better conditions for drivers. But that's because the hours of service rule doesn't work. Truckers, you see, have very little control over their schedules. Bad weather might force them off the road, unexpected traffic jams, shippers and recipients often keep the trucks idling for hours, and then there's parking. He says, if you aren't parked by 4 p.m. in New England, you're not going to find a spot. Sounds like Chicago. Such scarcity means truckers often cut their workday short just to make sure they have a place to throttle down for the night. He says you can't pause the clock, which he says removes his ability to make reasoned calls about a variety of situations, including those above. If there was a 5-mile backup traffic jam and I see a rest area, why shouldn't I be able to pull in there and rest until the road is clear? He says we were extremely hopeful for Trump. He was talking about removing regulations. He felt his hopes collapse when he saw Trump climb behind the wheel of a big rig on South Lawn. Those trucks were brought to the White House on behalf of the American Trucking Association. The industry's largest trade group supports the ELD rule and did not reply to a request for comment. He says, I saw that and I thought, well, okay, I guess they just got Trump in their back pocket. Um, I like that this article focuses on, this is when Donald Trump was president. They're pointing out the, the pivot that he did on them, the backstab. Um, this is my whole point. This is what happens when these people get put in power. They don't do what they said they were going to do. But also, realize the worst thing is this is not about money. They're not bribing the man, right? Like, Donald Trump is not bought and paid for. He has money. It's much worse than that. This is an acting job. In professional wrestling, you call it a work, meaning you're working the crowd and you're getting them to totally believe and invest in this role you're playing, this real life role you're playing. So it amazes me that, like, Jim Cornette, who's like a total wrestling genius, he's a wrestling historian, and this is a guy who totally hates Donald Trump, right? He actually does not like this guy, but he cannot see that this is a work, that he's actually a heel, and he's like just about the greatest heel manager ever. A wrestling heel is someone who plays the bad guy, right? They do what they want, they say what they want, they cheat the rules. A lot of people, they don't like them. They love booing for them, though. They're like the anti, the character they love to hate. Okay, they're the Ivan Dragos, right? Usually they're foreign, right? Usually they're something people don't relate to. They relate to the opposite of them, right? So, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? Rich, cheats his way to victory. Now that's not exactly Donald Trump, but it is. This is totally pro wrestling, right? And it's an acting job, and he's actually not playing the heel. He's playing the babyface, especially after this assassination attempt and everything. And fight, fight, fight. I mean, that's exactly what you do when you want to get somebody over with the crowd. That's what it's called, like getting them over. You're gonna put them in situations where they get jumped and they're fighting back valiantly. Some injustice happens to them, and the people watching, the audience, they resonate that and they want him to succeed. So when you see the guy get shot and get up and put his fist up in the air and all this thing with the trial now, and they can relate to him because Donald Trump, he talks like a simple guy, right? So the people relate to that, like, oh, he can see it too, the immigrants, China. And again, I want to dive deeper on the psychology behind it, not just on economics and control, but the psychology of it. Again, it's about translating what's happening not only in front of our eyes, but inside of us. So the last article I'm going to refer to is called Beyond the Politics of Nostalgia, The Fall of the Steel Industry and the Future of America. This is about steel now. Steel is, of course, what he imposed the tariffs on first, and it will be at the core, the forefront of the tariffs, that discussion as it unfolds. This article is the most recent. It's April 5th, 2024, just a few months ago. And although this comes from Frontier Group, which is a globalist think tank, okay, it's the source is very heavy with UN rhetoric, and the way you can tell it's in the UN's back pocket is because the United Nations are never mentioned anywhere on the website. That, to me, that's a dead giveaway. You're talking you're saying exactly what they say, but acting like you're totally independent from them. But the article does a great job talking about psychology, and again, that's why it's a good idea to read things from the World Economic Forum, from the CFR, from people who you consider your enemies. But when it comes to gathering information and learning, there is no such thing as an enemy. You're just learning from people who are in the know. It's a very good idea to know what they know. So this article says, he starts off saying, the future arrived in Pittsburgh in the 1980s. We just didn't recognize it. That is kind of like the little headline. In 1973, the United Steelworkers Union and the major steel producers, they negotiated one of the most generous labor contracts in U.S. history, making American steelworkers among the highest paid industrial workers on the planet. A decade later, many of the beneficiaries of that agreement were out of work. In other words, union negotiates big contract, collapses the industry. Old news, right? It's become clear to me that we have never fully and honestly come to grips with how and why the steel industry and other manufacturing industries that served as engines of broad middle class prosperity in the post war period died. That failure continues to haunt our politics, leaving us vulnerable to decision making, guided as much by economic nostalgia as by a clear vision of the challenges and opportunities of the future. So what you're hearing is this guy's talking about he's from Pittsburgh. He saw the steel industry. He saw the whole boom after the war. He saw how it collapsed. And he's now writing an article about what Donald Trump and what people are trying to do to fix it. It's really about that kind of nostalgia of bringing that back. It's very emotional. It's very psychological. It's not very rational. Again, this article is good because it talks about the history of it. And I've already said that these steel prices are hard to pin down what actually happened with the steel industry because it is complicated. So we're going to hear from somebody who saw it happen. It is no coincidence that one of the most lucrative labor contracts in U.S. history, the Steelworkers Experimental Negotiating Agreement, was agreed to in 1973. That year is now recognized as having marked the end of the post-war economic boom. It was a period of extraordinary economic growth in the United States and around the world. It is a period looked back upon nostalgically by both the American right and the left. By the right as a time of economic self-sufficiency, American global dominance, and stay-at-home moms. By the left as a time of broad middle-class prosperity, labor strength, rising social equality, and growing ambitions for the role of the welfare state in society. In other words, times were really good after the war. They would have been good before the war, but there was a war, right? And they were good before that. So the whole 20th century would have been like that. It would have been peachy. But the ruling class all over the world and the central bankers, they had all hands on deck in holding back the prosperity and liberty of the Industrial Revolution and the effects of that as much as possible. From World War I, you had the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, all of the things that made World War I happen. That was an occult, false flag, inside job. There's a lot of work about that. Then, as soon as the war is over, you have what? The Roaring Twenties. You had another economic boom. The Roaring Twenties were not just in America, it was all over the world. There was all this optimism after the war, right? All of a sudden, you didn't just have to focus on the war and throwing away your energy into making guns and tanks. You could actually take that energy and just actually raise your family at home, and you had a chance to make it. Then the central banksters trigger the stock market crash, okay? 1929, triggering the Great Depression, the 1930s. Meanwhile, in Europe, you have actual Bolshevism. You have also the dark occult socialist agents, Vladimir Lenin, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. I strongly suggest you watch a presentation called Two Masks, Same Face, The Dark Occult Origins of Nazism and Communism. I attended it. I'll link it here. And then you get World War II. And even that didn't stop the seeds from the free market from spreading, right? Even the whole war, even World War II, didn't stop it. Because after the war, now everything blows up. And there's optimism again, right? And for anybody who remembers the 60s, 70s, 80s, I don't. I was born in 96, but they tell me it was such an amazing time. It was great. It was an amazing time compared to now. And yes, those were the results of freedom. Okay? Now, the Industrial Revolution, in the sense of child labor and no running water, right? And working 20 hours a day. Obviously, that wasn't great. That was exploitative. But as soon as conditions get better and the results of that wealth, right? You let it kind of get going. And now you get the 1900s, where people have more freedom than they've ever had. They have more knowledge than they've ever had. And mainly, they have more wealth than they've ever had. It would have been beautiful. But in the background, this work was being done to undermine the Western joy and the Western optimism, especially by cutting down the material prosperity and wealth. Because yeah, health is wealth, meaning that, you know, what really makes you rich is how good you feel, how healthy you are. But also, wealth is health. Like, there's the other side of this coin. If you have money, you have money to rest, right? You don't have to work yourself to exhaustion. You have the money to pay somebody who really knows what they're doing, right? To try new things, to eat better, right? Let's not pretend like money is not correlated to health. Um, and of course, we know that super rich people are super unhealthy. But these are like the robber barons, right? Just because these billionaires aren't healthy, look, if you made your fortune by being a weasel and a rat, then obviously you're not going to be healthy if you're living immoral. But if you're living, you know, an honorable, moral lifestyle, and you have money, it's way better for you to have a lot of money. There's nothing wrong with being rich. Yeah. But with American industry, it's very simple what happened. The rich steel companies, they were pushed into these pension and health care benefit commitments. And then they brought them down. This article correctly identifies that. But then the article states that there was a natural decrease in demand, and then these other nations built up the steel industries and organically took over because they have the competitive advantage, they have the lower labor costs. In other words, he doesn't just blame it on the government. I do. Because I asked the question, well, why are the labor costs of those countries lower? I don't just take it as eternal truth that sweatshops in China make it so that there's no way an American company can employ American workers and compete with them. I totally reject this. If you dramatically lower the taxes and regulations, and every worker can work the hours and conditions that they agree to, total freedom, no insurance, no benefits, no minimum wage unless they want to give it to you. You negotiated. People could make a dignified wage, and they could be, the quality would be 10 times as high, right? You could pay them 10 times as much as they do in China, right? Not 14 cents an hour. You could pay them like $15-$20 an hour. But the quality would be 10 times better as well. And you would also cut out the overseas shipping, right? You would the companies would be more flexible to be more responsive with the market. The quality would be better. The people would be more skilled. And you could still charge way more for the clothes. And if it's reasonable, people will still buy it. If the quality is a lot better, you can charge twice as much for something and people buy it. Do we not do that now? Why are people acting like it has to be made in China or else people won't buy it? They're not that stupid, right? And on top of it, if you paid the people in cash without taxes, even if you took the taxes off, pay them cash, it would fuel the economy. I take it back. No taxes. Cash, no taxes. It would fuel the economy. And then the amount of work you do, you shouldn't be paid by the hour. You should be paid by the amount of work you do based on your productivity. That would revolutionize the world again. It's like you're increasing your productivity by so much. And people think this is impossible, but I say, look at how many hours people are spending playing video games, live streaming. Like they're really they're working hard doing this. They talk about the grind, like I'm grinding. They sit there for like hours and hours every day, like playing this game. There's a whole dopamine fueled work ethic in this country under the surface. And I know it's toxic, like it gets released in toxic ways, but you can, if you actually gave these, kids that are disillusioned with college, they're trying to pay their way through college, if you gave them this option at least, like, hey, you can actually make a lot of money. You gotta get in there though, and I'm not talking sweatshops, but you got to get in there, and if you can work as much as you want to, and let them do it themselves. Develop the discernment, okay? This is how we can actually fix a generation of kids and young adults who just cannot do things for themselves. They can't mail a letter, right? They can't fix a light bulb, right? They can't change a light bulb. You could harness that and take the training wheels off of the country, and it would dominate the world economy once again. Again, like China is no giant to be afraid of. And it's the unions and the restrictions on businesses that blew up China. He says this, in the popular political imagination, the decline in industries that had once employed large numbers of Americans, from steel to electronics to automobiles, is the result of competition from lower cost producers overseas, and that has certainly played a big role. But there is no country in the world today, not even China, which has been engaged for the last several decades in its own version of the Western world's post-war building binge that employs a great share of the population in manufacturing, as the US did in the 1950s. In other words, he's concurring with the idea that China has not taken America's place. They're not as dominant as people seem to think. Look what he says. Yet, the idea that public policy can bring back some semblance of the golden days continues to persist, despite decades of failed economic development schemes aimed towards attaining the holy grail of good jobs. Good jobs. For the American left, government incentivization of industry, like green industrial policy, plus unionization, is seen as the path back to the promised land of broadly shared prosperity. For the right, unfettering industry, freeing them from the shackles of oppressive regulation, while, in the Trump era anyway, providing protection against imports from geopolitical rivals, is the magic ticket. I feel like a lot of this reading is a little bit choppy, so I'm trying to explain what I'm reading. The left thinks that they can take it back to the old days, and more unions and all this is what is needed. Then the Republicans, they're saying that now we got to protect it from China. We got to protect imports from our geopolitical rivals. On both sides, they're pulling out slogans that harken back to the past. Green New Deal, Make America Great Again. They're both calling upon former things. FDR's New Deal, right? And the greatness of, industrial America, post-war industrial America. Both slogans to rally the public. That's what he says. And I love this. Someone else has identified the romanticism and the nostalgia behind modern politics. It's almost like someone who used to be a pro wrestler can see this pro wrestler strategy in getting the crowd to emotionally invest in this false conflict. Again, it's working the crowd. So he says, in the 2016 election, my home region provided the margin of victory for Donald Trump, Pennsylvania. One of Trump's great political skills is in providing the ways for people who perceive themselves to have been on the downside of the economic and societal transitions affecting America over the last several decades to structure their experience and make some sense of it. In other words, he's saying that Trump can really dumb it down for a lot of you folks who left your discernment and cognitive ability back in the 90s. And that's how it is in pro wrestling too. The best storylines and gimmicks are the simple ones. People don't want to follow a complex story with nuance. They can't handle it. They want their guy to go out there, tell him, all those other guys out here, they don't like me because I give you what you want. They don't like me because I tell it like it is. I'm going to win whether you like it or not. And that's the bottom line because Stone Cold said so. Give me a hell yeah. And crack 2 beers and walk out with that. And people can work with that. They can't work with you telling them how it actually is and how it actually works, and here are all the things you need to study to know it for yourself. It's crazy. I've had an intelligent woman tell me yesterday, I watch your videos sometimes, but I'll be honest, I don't really understand a lot of it. No, that's right. I know for Polish people who watch these videos that kind of don't get the language, they're just seeing the subtitles. They don't really get a lot of it because obviously these subtitles, right, they're YouTube automated, generated. It's not going to be the same thing. But it's not just the language, It's just the sad thing. Back to the article. Mainstream leaders across the political spectrum have failed to do that, have failed to provide more cogent and compelling ways for people to make sense of their experience of the modern economy and modern society. I think is no small contributor to the overall loss of legitimacy in our institutions and the crisis in our politics. Again, he's saying that this guy came around and he really simplified it for people, for a whole large sector of the population that saw that this progress towards whatever America is progressing towards, it's not working. And they've, again, short-term memory, right? So these people woke up and they're thinking, what happened? Where did our freedom go? Where did our wealth go? Where did our way of life go, right? And this guy comes around and he makes sense of it for them. Again, this is why I make the parallels between this and Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, because after World War I, they basically destroyed Germany. They look for the common German person who was living there at the time. They didn't do anything wrong. They weren't guilty of anything. It's not their fault that the government went to war against all of Europe and then basically got fucked economically. For years they got them to sign this treaty that basically put them into poverty for decades. So then a guy comes around and he starts talking about making sense of it. He starts making sense of it with I don't want to. It's an hour-long video. I don't want to get banned for saying, for saying any Israeli-like references to it. But the things that Hitler said. The point is that worked. It was very simplistic. He really simplified it, even though he himself was getting sponsored by a lot of those bankers. They weren't Muslim bankers. They weren't Christian bankers. You know what kind of bankers they were, right? That were bankrolling Hitler and Lenin's journey through Europe, right? So, the point is, Hitler's rhetoric worked because it was really simple. It really simplified it, and it really made it us versus them. It really made it romantic. Again, this is national romanticism is coming back around. And this is the same thing that worked in Germany around those times. And the more they call Donald Trump Hitler, I know it's ridiculous, but you'll see. This is my prediction. It's already had a lot of parallels with the assassination attempt, with the impeachment trial, okay, with that chart that he looked at right before he got shot in the ear. He paraded that chart around as like a symbol of like it's a miracle, like it's literally like God saved him, right? This is a very spiritual and emotional thing that people are following. This is why you're going to notice that a lot of these conservatives, they're going to start to become more detached from reality and more almost religious now. There's a very, very religious, like a charismatic leader type of a deal. And that chart, he then took it to a whole lot of rallies and he pointed back at it and he said, that chart saved my life. It's the same thing as the blood flag of the Nazi party, where after there was a clash with the police when the Nazi party was young, the National Socialist Party, they shot a guy and he died, and some of that blood spilled onto their flag. And this is why that Nazi flag became such a powerful symbol that got those people to go along with that. It's nostalgia for the past. It's nostalgia even for a past that these people don't remember, but they crave. They want that. Again, it's romanticizing the nation as family, the motherland, the fatherland. This is what it actually is, and this article doesn't go that far in talking about it, but I love that it identifies that nostalgia. Nostalgia is absolutely a big part of this. Now, wrapping this article up, nothing about our current moment in history, the rise of automation, the rise in inequality, the growing salience of environmental challenges and limitations, the crisis of meaning and happiness in America, nothing suggests that any of this is going to get any easier. In the absence of any better explanation of how the world works, people will inevitably turn even more aggressively to what they believed had worked in the past. or to anyone who can weave together a story, even if that story is a fairy tale, that makes it all make sense. I'm very impressed with that conclusion. I'm very impressed with the crisis of meaning and happiness being mentioned. And that's sort of the elephant in the room in all this here. Like, in the past few years, life just feels hollow. A lot of people say this, especially young adults can perceive this. Um, because they can kind of still remember, like, they were young, they were optimistic, and now it's all kind of fallen. I think the people who are older, they've already become disillusioned with the world. So it's not really anything drastic, the crisis of meaning and happiness. But the adults, like people who are supposed to be starting families now, they could see it. Life has gotten really hollow. And it's because there's been a massive disruption in the world after the pandemic, this whole thing. And really what it has shown is that the reason that life was as good as it was in the 2000s, 2010s, it's because that was really still those fruits of freedom that were started way back in the 1700s and 1800s. And now you shook that up, right? You dusted it off. You knocked the dust off. But there's no foundation, no underlayment now to rebuild it. It's going to take real passion based on real principles to rebuild that. And this guy's right. People are going to follow whoever can make sense of what has happened. But unfortunately, it has to be made simple. And that is why my channel is not very popular, you know? But that was my vision when I made episode 1 of This Week in Tyranny. I was going to use what everyone paid attention to, right? All of the main stories, to make sense of things, to weave in the truth, to talk principles, psychology, philosophy. And next week is going to make it 2 years running, week after week, that I've done this. And I'm going to keep doing it. I'm going to keep translating and deciphering. And it's going to help a lot of people. But to really help the general population of people make sense of it, to really help people make sense of this world, I need you to do it. Like, I need you to help, because it's going to take people who don't talk like me exactly, they don't think like me. It's going to take a different person to actually get people to understand. Part of this is just more people, and part of this is people who, I don't know, aren't nerds like me, you know, who aren't, it's not about how intelligent you are, but there is something to the way you speak that makes you relatable or not relatable to a large group of people. And just the way I do things, it just is the way it is, okay? Maybe not so flashy, maybe a little bit, you know, complex. It's definitely very dense. I can't help but make dense episodes, dense as in filled with information. It's an hour and a half. I keep trying to make the episode shorter. I just can't do it because I start to go into these topics. I'm like, oh my God, this is so important. This needs to be talked about. And, you know, I hope that is a great feel for you. But I need your help. And for you listening to me that thinks that you can't articulate things well, that the words just don't come to you. Hey, look, they're listening to Donald Trump over there. They were listening to Kamala Harris over there. So you could do this. Trust me, you have the words, you have the skills to articulate things and make sense of the world for people. It really doesn't take much. You don't need to be the next This Week in Tyranny, but absolutely we need people to just start explaining things simply, and you'll find the ways to latch on and to, because again, people are looking for what works. They're looking for the nostalgia. They're looking for that kind of emotional homeliness, and try it, and you can provide that for them, and then inject the truth. That is my conclusion. Yeah, we went from tariffs to nostalgia and emotion, right, and passion, because that's absolutely the conclusion here. In the meantime, let's stop paying those taxes. Let's stop following all those regulations, and let the passion do what it might when the day comes that might be necessary. You feel me? So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week on This Week in Tyranny.